Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It's Thursday, April 17, 2025 at 3:03 in the afternoon. And so we are going to take a look at H205, which is agreements not to compete. So I think we'll see how far we can get. We have our council stable with us. So, afternoon, Rick. Love your new mug.
Thank you. Yes. I just wanted to show the House Energy Committee gave me this mug, gifted the mug, but they didn't do the dinner. So your gift
We're still in
to
the
West
running.
Council. Still in the running. But this is more permanent.
Yeah,
I feel like that was a challenge.
apparently,
I
apparently memory fades after.
I think it was this session, Mr. Chair, that we had the dinner, but I can't remember. No, I had a great dinner. No, there's no competition. Because they've won. I'm just kidding. All right. Rick Sagel, Office of Legislative Counsel. So H205, there's two parts to H205, and they're similar, but they're different. This will make more sense when I get into it. But the first part is they're both non-competes, but the first part is about franchises and how franchise agreements sometimes contain these non-compete agreements. And the second part is probably much more familiar to you all. It's the employer-employee non-compete agreements, which get to that as well. So the first part is the franchise agreements. So we're creating a new chapter in Title IX. And the definitions, critical here because there's not much to the law, especially when it comes to franchise. It's pretty straightforward. But the definition of agreement not to compete is very important. So it means an agreement between a franchisor and franchisee that restricts the franchisee after separating from the franchisor from operating its business in a certain geographic area for a certain period of time or in any other way that significantly impacts the ability of the franchisee to compete with the franchisor. So that is the specific definition of that. It has to be one of those three things. Otherwise, it's not an agreement not to compete. The third subdivision is a bit broad. It's meant to bring in other things that maybe the legislature cannot consider at the time. But certainly 1 and 2, the geographic area, period of time, are the most common types of non-compete agreements. B, an agreement not to compete does not include an agreement that prohibits the disclosure of trade secrets as defined, and I can pull that up if you need it, or a non-disclosure agreement that protects confidential business information that does not constitute a trade secret. So a couple of exceptions here. These agreements do exist where there is some type of, it's not really maybe a severance, it's more of the employer-employee, but some type of a separating agreement to where there's critical information known by the franchisor regards to trade secrets or some type of confidential information. Those are not included in the scope. Franchise agreement means an agreement in which a franchisor grants a franchisee the right to operate a business or to offer, sell, or distribute goods or services identified or associated with the franchisor's trademark. Franchisee means a person who currently operates or formerly operated a business under a franchisor's name, trademark, or other identifying information pursuant to a franchise agreement. Franchisor means a person that sells the right to operate a business to a franchisee pursuant to a franchise agreement. Okay, now here's what it actually does. Any agreement not to compete, including an agreement not to compete contained within a contract or franchise agreement, is void and unenforceable. So again, that sounds pretty broad, and it is, but remember we've defined what an agreement not to compete is, and it's those geographic restriction, I'll back to so I don't miss anything, geographic area for a certain period of time, or in any other way that significantly impacts the ability of the franchisee to compete with the franchisor. So these agreements are effectively, if this bill passes, it becomes law, they would be unenforceable. And that includes, as I get to this, subsection B for existing agreements. So let's say these agreements are in effect before the law passes. The franchisor must notify each franchisee that is party to the agreement that the agreement not to compete is void and legally unenforceable. Notice shall be in the form of a written individualized communication addressed to the franchisee or former franchisee and shall be delivered to the last known address and email address of the franchisee or former franchisee. So that's the franchise portion of this. Are there any questions about that?
Trying to get my head wrapped around some of the definitions. So the agreement not to compete, that is after separating from the franchisor from operating its business. It refers to
The franchisee.
but it's not the same business. It would be the franchise, burger chain.
Mhm.
And the franchisee wants to open their own burger joint.
Mhm.
It's business. It isn't so it's not the trademark business. It's some other
Right.
similar type of.
Tips Burgers, right, under a different name. Yeah.
But if I went into contract with him and he was allowing me, because you do real estate, right?
Yeah.
So you and I, we go into business together or whatever, and I signed a no compete not to sell properties in your area. This would null and void that?
So it had to be a franchisee franchisor situation, which is pretty specific, right? It's got to be you are using his realtor name. Let's say he owns a realty company, Tony Nicholas Homes, right?
So-
And you create a franchise based on that name, and you have your own storefront, not storefront. You have your own office, right? And you use his logo, his marketing materials, and you probably pay him 10% or something, right? Franchise fees. So if you separate, then you'd be able to use your own Michael Booten real estate and still continue your business of selling homes, but it'd be under your name, and he would not be able to restrict you based on the franchise agreement that you
Even
had.
though we agreed originally that I wouldn't do that. to him.
Right. If there's an existing agreement, if there's a new agreement, if this law passes and that would be unenforceable. There's certain things that you cannot contract, and this would be one of them. You cannot contract if this becomes law, right?
But I could make it, you can't go after my customers. This law.
Sure.
Allows.
As long as it's not significantly impact his business. So if your contract said you can't go after clients within 100 miles of my office, that could be restrictive. And that could significantly impact. It'd be up to a court, but yeah. Okay, so I go to the employer-employee. So here we go. So this is in Title 21. This is the labor and employment section. My colleague Sophie Zadadny, if you have questions about this, she will probably come and testify to this. I can certainly read it and give you my best information about it. But if you want specific employer-employee stuff, then I would recommend her to come in and provide testimony. So we're in a different title, different section. Even though the words are the same, they mean different things now. So agreement not to compete is now a different definition. It means an agreement between an employer and employee that restricts the employee after separating from employment from performing work for another employer for a specified period of time, work in a specified geographical area, or work for another employer in a capacity similar to the employee's work for the employer's former employer, for the employee's former employer that is party to the agreement. So here are the three things, right? Any of these three things would constitute an agreement not to compete.
What does one say? I'm sorry. Yeah. Work for another employer for a specified period. It's got to be a similar line of work. Is that the assumption, or is that, three would seem to be more specific to case in point, but what's the purpose of one?
So I think it's really about the time portion of this. So 3 does not speak to time. 1 does speak to time. So it would be for any employer, so if you're employed as a, we'll stay in the real estate business, if you're a realtor for a company and you signed an agreement not to compete, and it says if you were ever to separate from this company, you could not work for any realtor company for a year, 2 years. You wouldn't sign one of this at any company at all, right? That wouldn't be legal. So it would probably be a realty company. So it's the time that they're concerned about here.
Yeah,
And maybe it needs to be written more clearly.
it seems overly broad to me. It seems like it could apply to any employer.
It could,
So,
but why would a contract do that? Why would a person agree to?
very good question, Mr. Lawyer.
It wouldn't be enforceable. I'll just kind of say that blanket statement that would not be enforceable. If you, for some reason, don't read the contract, which I don't blame you, and you agree to not work for any other company for a year after you quit, that would be unenforceable. So I see your point, but
And really compete by definition is in a similar industry. I mean, it's one thing,
Well-
you leave my realty organization to go work for another realty organization, but it's another if you go work for, doing semiconductors for, IBM or something. That's not even anywhere close to the same
Well,
industry. So
I certainly agree with the intent, but I don't think the language narrows it down.
We're just going through the language now, so.
okay. So then we have again some exceptions to this. So agreements not to compete do not include 1, an agreement that prohibits the disclosure of a trade secret, or a non-disclosure agreement that protects confidential business information that does not constitute a trade secret, similar to the franchisee exception, or a non-solicitation agreement between an employer and an employee, provided that the limitations set forth in the agreement are reasonable in time, geographic area, and the scope of the activity to be restrained. What is a non-solicitation agreement? That is the next definition. It means an agreement between an employer and an employee pursuant to which the employee agrees not to A, solicit or recruit the employer's employees, or solicit or transact business with customers or clients of the employer who were customers or clients while the employee was employed by the employer. So again, this is an exception, as long as they're reasonable. You can have these in these contracts, employment contracts, as long as they are reasonable in time, area, and scope. Severance agreement, which we'll get to in a second, means an agreement between an employer and employee pursuant to which the employee voluntarily agrees to leave employment with the employer for a sum of money or other consideration. Okay, here's the language. B, prohibition. An agreement not to compete, including an agreement not to compete contained within the contract, is void and unenforceable. Pretty clear to the point there. Exceptions.
Back to the higher. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, so big B, double I, non-solicitation agreement. Can I assume that the phrase reasonable in time, geographical area, and scope is kind of well-defined in court law or been construed? Maybe I shouldn't assume. I guess it's quite.
When you use the word reasonable,
Right.
that is kind of up to a subjective standard of what the court thinks is reasonable, and it probably depends on the type of work that is involved. If it's specialized work, maybe the reasonableness is different. For a job that's flipping burgers, I know you're probably not signing a non-compete, although I've been surprised sometimes they're in some fairly lower paying jobs. But that it would depend on the type of job.
Right. If I remember from some tests, I can't remember. Maybe it was these types of statutes have been enacted in quite a few states, if I remember. Yeah.
I can't tell you how many. That's a Sophie question, but they have been enacted. Yes.
So I'm just insuring on my mind. I guess my question, maybe it's a question for your colleague. but that's probably been construed. The reasonableness of the scope limitation time is
It
probably,
may have been.
probably been, depending on the facts, but probably been construed. It's not.
Exceptions. Nothing in this section shall be construed to prohibit an individual from entering into an agreement not to compete in relation to one, the sale of all or substantially all of the individual's ownership interest in a business or its operating assets, or a subsidiary or division of a business, or the operating assets of a subsidiary or division of a business. So typically when you enter into those types of sales, there's language preventing you from the next day opening up a shop that directly competes with this place you just sold. So for those types of agreements, it's generally seen as you're selling it, you're earning money for that sale. You shouldn't then be able to compete with that person you just sold the business to. That's the reason for that exception. Two, the dissolution of a partnership in which the individual is a partner, or the disassociation of the individual from a partnership. Three, the dissolution of a limited liability company in which the individual is a member of, or the termination of an individual's interest in a limited liability company. Four, a severance agreement, provided the limitations set forth in the agreement are reasonable in a time, provided further that the limitation on time cannot exceed the number of weeks or months of pay, however appropriately calculated, that the employer offers to the employee in consideration to sign the agreement. B, geographical area, and C, the scope of the activity to be restrained. So again, when you sign a severance agreement, typically you are given some kind of consideration, usually money, and the public policy there is that because you're getting consideration for this, they can also request that you don't compete for a certain amount of time. This would require it to be reasonable in time, and we have some clear, I think fairly clear set of regulations on time, right? That it cannot exceed the number of weeks or months of pay that you are given for severance. And then the other two, geographical area and scope of activity. D, the wage threshold. Subject to subdivision 2 coming up, this section shall not apply to an agreement not to compete between an employer and employee to whom the employer pays $100,000 or more annually in gross wages. So fairly big exception. If that is your annual salary, you can enter into those agreements not to compete with the employer, and they can be enforced. However, an employer requiring a prospective employee to sign an agreement not to compete that is in accordance with the section shall provide the prospective employee with the proposed agreement at the time the offer of employment to the prospective employee is made, and not rescind the offer of employment to the prospective employee any earlier than 3 business days after the prospective employee receives the agreement not to compete. So this gives the employee notice that this is part of the deal, that you want this job. It obviously will pay more than 6 figures or over 6 figures. And therefore, there's going to be a not compete attached to your employment agreement. Notice, for existing agreements not to compete that violate this section, the employer must notify each employee that is part of the agreement that the agreement not to compete is void and legally unenforceable. Notice shall be in the form of a written communication, same thing as the franchise, notice. F, the provisions against retaliation and the penalty and enforcement provisions shall apply to the section. That is a Sophie question. Please do not ask me what that means because I do not know much about retaliation. But I imagine it's kind of as it speaks what retaliation is. And it would take effect July 1st, 2025.
I feel like 100,000 isn't quite enough. I mean, in this day, and especially in Vermont, I mean, most people, that's like an average salary in Vermont.
You don't live in the Northeast Kingdom, just.
All right, I'll give you that. I live in Chittenden County.
Well, maybe we put a section in.
But could we like do like top 5% of the payroll or something like that? Is that a feasible thing? Like, or to have it tied to like you would be considered a key person or something like that?
You can decide, yeah, there's several ways to do it, I think. Up to the committee to discuss, what that would look like and what you want to be, have it to be.
So remember, we just walked through the language. We have questions on language. Other things, will come when we have witnesses. I don't know that there'll be anybody wanting to testify to this, but there may be. So through that process, we'll develop the bill that way. Abby?
Just so I understand going through that, so let's say you make $80,000, you would not be able to have a non-compete agreement, but you could have a non-solicitation agreement with them.
Right.
Right, so like when they start, it didn't sound like it was something that has to be given, like, would you have to have that agreement when they start? Or could you, let's say like into their tenure, like, oh, wow, like this person's now become a salesperson, you want to have a non-solicitation agreement with them, you could do it while they're employed. You could say, hey, just in case you leave. I just want to think about small businesses where sometimes roles change, right? And so all of a sudden you have someone who, oh, they're a salesperson and I'd like to protect the business by saying you can't go out and solicit the current customers if you were to leave. I mean, not that I have had that experience. Okay, yes, I have. And it's like par for the course, fine. I'm just curious whether or not it would be something that you could have.
Yeah. So I would look to the definition of non-solicitation and seeing what that it's because it's specifically this, right? It's subdivision 2, A and B. So if it fits that, then yes, you can do that. And if it's reasonable in time, geographic area, and scope of activity, then yes, you could do that. But
Okay.
You would obviously want to make sure your ducks in a row and make sure that contract is,
Yeah.
yeah. But yes, you could do it.
Yeah, great. Now I'm just trying to understand the sort of what's possible and what's not.
Yeah.
All right, so I've only signed one of these my entire life, and it's like 20 for a collection agency. And I was making like 24,000 at the max. So in that particular case, if it was a franchise collection agency, which I don't know if they exist, but if it was, this would not apply to me because I'm under the 100,000.
So you were not a franchisee, right?
Well,
You were paid
they were-
by,
Let's say that I worked for this collection
Mhm.
agency, maybe it wasn't a franchisee, but if it was,
well, you wouldn't be making, you would be having your own shop, right? And you would have your own LLC, you'd have your own company, and then you would be using the trademarks, the marketing material of the franchisor.
like McDonald's.
This applies to
The first part.
the first part, yes, the
Right.
franchise. Oh, but there's even small businesses franchise occasionally.
Right.
But so that's the first section is franchise. But you may have been in an employer-employee situation where you, even if you were paid low, you still may have been an employee. Where this, if you were making that less money, then that agreement would not be enforceable if this law were to pass. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because it's not connected to the franchisee,
They're two separate things, right?
two separate things.
Yes. Yeah.
So. But it's still, okay.
Good questions for Rick?
You really nailed it all the time. Nice work.
Well, I get paid only until 3:30.
While you're in here.
Right, that's right. That's right. That's fair.
You make more in the Senate?
I can't disclose that.
It's got a non-disclosure agreement.
There's less of them.
Do we need a non-compete with him between us and the House?
Yeah.
Find out what's going on.
Okay, I think that's it for today for us. We will line up. Witnesses testify on this, the next week or the following week. We'll let everybody know. So, there is a film at 4. People want to go and see it. Having to deal with social media and the effects that it has, especially on children. If you want to look at that, it's at 4 o'clock in room 11.
Bring some tissues. if you want.
Yeah,
Yeah, that'd be active there. Sure. Otherwise, we're back here. We have Helen tomorrow.
Friday.
8:45. She's.
Helen's gonna be here tomorrow.
Michael,
Helen.
Helen, yeah, she'll be here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Helen will be here at 8:45.
You have opportunities to look at what's going on in your committees that you're watching.
Yeah.
Please bring that information here.
Piece,
well and so.
yeah, so then after the floor, 117, we'll have Sophie walk us through the new draft and hear from the Department of Labor. And Jamie, did you wanna testify tomorrow too on? So we'll take hopefully there's time to look at 117, but we will be done at noon tomorrow.